Hello everyone, my name is Moish Steigman, the Mindful Rabbi, and I am so excited and honored to once again be having a conversation with my cousin and my dear friend, Ben Callif. You might recall, but a year and a half or so ago.
It's been a while.
Yeah, Own Your Judaism, which is the organization that I founded and of which I'm a director. Own Your Judaism hosted a live stream conversation with Ben and with me. And now we are back here today to talk about something different. Ben and I got together last week.
Yes.
Last week, we were just getting together to catch up, as we often do and love to do. And we started talking about what we're going to talk about now. Ben had the idea of maybe making a video out of this. So thank you to Ben for the idea. Thanks for coming to join me. And thank you all for watching, listening, and as always, if and when you have any questions or comments and reflections, please send them my way and I'll reply, or Ben will reply, or will reply. So thanks again for being here.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks for having the conversation.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I mean, my recollection was the last time we talked, whenever that was, like it was a conversation about Jewish identity and sort of how I feel about the concept of being Jewish and what that all means to me. And since then, I've done a lot of reflection, largely with your help, about, well, yeah, of course, I mean, you're good at what you do. That's why we talked last week too, actually, because last time you really helped me work through like what it means to be Jewish, and I know that's what Own Your Judaism is all about, and our philosophy aligns in a lot of ways regarding that, and so it was really helpful for me as I thought through like my Jewish identity to have this framework of like different types of Judaism, like a cultural kind, an ethnic kind, religious kind of Judaism. And so as I worked through my own Jewish identity, having these buckets and this like framework for like what does it mean for me to be Jewish was super helpful. So, like took a DNA test, and like my DNA test says I'm 100% Jewish.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But I don't really consider myself to be religiously Jewish, and maybe like partially culturally Jewish. And so having these like this categorization technique to fit myself into Jewish life was super helpful. And so over the last year, obviously the big topic on everyone's mind, but largely Jews in the United States and other people involved in the Middle East conflicts, like, is Israel. And what does that mean? And so I think a lot like Judaism, Israel is this big, controversial, hairy topic that we just don't have conversation about in a nuanced or logical way. And so when we sat down, we were just talking about random stuff, and you like had this really clean framework to categorize what Israel means in different lenses, just like the way that Judaism has multiple meanings. Like you just laid it out so clearly. And so I wanted to, I asked you to make a video because it really helped me.
Thank you.
And I thought it would probably help other people.
Thank you.
You said, we'll sit down and make the video with me.
Let's do it together.
So here we
Exactly.
are.
Thank you. And I'm so glad that we talked too, because as much as you say I helped you, you helped me too, giving me, feed forward. I use feed forward and not feedback. Giving me feed forward, helping me crystallize things, because I've been teasing this around only for a few weeks. I believe this is actually a framework that they used at Olin St. Ruby, which is a Jewish summer camp in Oconomowoc, a little bit west of Milwaukee. So I believe this is a framework they used there. And then when I heard it, it really coalesced, because I've been looking for ways to try to make sense of something that doesn't seem to be making sense in general, which is, what is the interplay between being Jewish and Israel? Or being Israel or not Jewish or not Israel? And what does this all mean? And what I think has become more and more clear to me over the past 12 months is that we as individual Jews don't often have that complete clarity of what I believe my multifaceted relationship to Israel is. As a human being, as a Jew, as someone who's Jewish adjacent, are my Jewish and Israel relationships actually completely separate? Do they overlap? How do I engage with that? And I think if I, as a Jew, see an interweaving, which is sometimes healthy and sometimes muddying, I can only imagine that we as a Jewish community have all of these different relationships and muddying of things, which also means it's really hard for us to name what we are hoping for from friends, from allies, as a Jew, as Israelis, and what our connections may or may not be between all of them, right? Does what Israel does that reflect on me as a Jew or not? Some will say yes, some will say no. Do I want it to? Do I have, all of these things are so muddied in the individual Jewish ethos and the collective Jewish ethos. They're certainly even more muddied after October 7th, when, when someone says that being Jewish and being Israeli are two different things, which they are. And then when a Jewish person says after October 7th, I would hope that you'd reach out to me and ask me how I'm doing. Well, I thought the two identities were separate. And if they're separate, you're not going to reach out to me. And they're not completely separate, so of course you should reach out. It's just so muddying. So when I heard this framework, it helped me start to clarify things, and then I think through conversation with you too, it really helped me pinpoint it. And then you came up with this idea of really the Venn diagram, these intersections of the different ways to approach it. So that was incredibly helpful for me.
Well, I mean, like I said, I asked you to do the work and explain it to me, so I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that there is a nice feed-forward loop going on.
Absolutely. All right, so let me take one quick step back from being so obtuse, because I've used somewhat vague language. When I think of being Jewish and being in relationship with Israel, according to the Torah, we are Bnei Yisrael. Right? We are the children of Israel, which I think is literal, because we have our ancestors. We have Abraham and Sarah, who had two kids, Ishmael and Isaac. Again, according to the Torah, the Jewish continuity comes through Isaac. Isaac then married Rebekah. Rebekah and Isaac had two sons, Esau and Jacob. And we have a story of Jacob at some point wrestling with what most of us understand to be an angel or some kind of emissary of God. And Jacob defeats this emissary, this angel. This angel kind of rests Jacob's leg and then says, you will no longer be called Jacob. Instead, your new name will be Yisrael, Israel, which literally means a person who wrestles with God. So part of what it means to be a Jew is to be in dynamic relationship and tension with God and with our identity. So if we're in muddy waters, we're actually doing something that we're supposed to be doing as Jews. Not always comforting. But if we're Bnei Yisrael, we're literally the descendants of Jacob, who got renamed Israel. So on one hand, it's very, very literal that we are the people that comes from Jacob as our ancestors. We're the Israelites, right? You could be the Ishmaelites, right? People who come from Ishmael. Right? So we are the Israelites in that sense. In the larger context, that kind of became known as the Israelite people, which was the de facto name for the Jewish people in the time of the Torah and the Tanakh in the Bible. So the Jewish people and the Israelites, and now the country that exists is called Israel. It wasn't even called Israel in the time of the Tanakh, right? But you're supposed to get to Eretz Yisrael, supposed to get the land of Israel. Then it was Judah, and then it was the northern tribe, then the southern kingdom, and then it was Israel, and then Judah, and then all these names got intermixed. So now we're the children of Jacob who share a name with this country and this land. So what are we? And the framework that I heard is that Yisrael, which is the Hebrew for Jacob's name and also for Israel, that Yisrael is often used in three different contexts in Jewish teachings and wisdom literature. One is as a Medina, one is as Eretz, and one is as Am. Medina literally means state. Eretz literally means land, and Am literally means people or nation. So when we talk about being Yisrael, we could be talking about one single aspect of that. We could be talking about two of those aspects and not the third. We could be talking about all three. So I think this video is to kind of unpack a little bit what each of those individual aspects would be and what it might be when a couple or all of them overlap.
Yes, correct. So let me see if I got this straight. We have the state, the land, and the people.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And this is how I'm now understanding each of those. So you might have a different understanding, and I know when we talked last week, you reframed a couple of things. So please keep doing that. I only learn whenever you share. And I do have some notes here. Usually I'm pretty good at doing these things from memory, but so if I'm looking down over here from time to time, I do have some notes because this is also coalescing. And obviously, if anyone watching this video has thoughts or reflections, please let us know. So when I think of Medina, I'm thinking of the political and geographic entities that's Israel. Currently, Israel has a government, right? It has a prime minister. It has borders, right? Which may or may not be in dispute. So there's political and geographic entities, right? There's the United States, there's the government, there's the Congress, there are the lines that define the territories. Mm-hmm. That's what I think of when I think of this state. I think of it much more in a political and geographic realm. When I think of Eretz, I'm thinking of the land in many ways agriculturally, right? Because part of what Jews and Israelites have done historically is work the land, right? That there's land to be worked. The holidays in the Torah are all about the agricultural cycle, right? The holidays as we understand them today, Sukkot, for instance, we build a booth, we shake the lulav and etrog and all those things. But then it was a part of the holiday harvest season, right? It was really the culmination, the end of the harvest season, right? So the holidays in the Torah are really connected with the agricultural cycle. That's what I think of when it comes to Eretz. For we are a people. We are a nation, right? We are the descendants of Jacob, right? We have a common ancestor. That brings us together, right? Not unlike being, we're cousins, right? Your dad was really instrumental in putting together our massive family tree, right? We can trace it back to a couple of people, right? So I forgot what their last name was, all the way back to generations.
Oh, geez, I could pull up my DNA test if you.
You can do that. I can pull up your dad's chart, right? But it is, we can trace ourselves back to them. Friedland, it was Friedland and somebody, but either way, we're like the Friedlandites. That's the of Yisrael. We are the Jacobites. That's how I'm seeing those three. How does that resonate so far?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, you said there's muddiness there. And so I'm curious, I may be preempting our conversation a little bit, because when I hear, we'll start with the state, you describe that as like a government, essentially, an entity that is like governing or overseeing a geopolitical boundary. Mm-hmm. And I hear a little bit of overlap. I mean, it sort of steps into the land aspect of it. Like, I mean, you can draw a line on a map, and that's not the same thing as actually being on the land. So I'm looking forward to hearing how the overlap between the state as a political entity and the land as a geography touch each other in that way. And then the same thing with like the land and the people and the state. You called the people a nation, which is language that, I mean, the Jewish community uses quite frequently, right? Right. And so there's pretty hefty overlap as you talk about people into geopolitical entity of like, does a nation have to have clear boundaries? Does it have to have a physical land? Those are the kinds of things that I think about. And with the land, last time we talked about agriculture, and when you said that, it made me think of resources writ large, of like, what are the things that a land provides, not just agriculture, but also like potentially like minerals from mining or oil off the coast that they're drilling right now, or all of the things that countries tend to go to war with each other over. Right. Where we're fighting over the oil, not even necessarily the geopolitical boundary, but just like what resources the land can provide for us. So that's, I mean, I'm looking forward to diving into how these things intersect. Yeah.
Me too. And this is where you were so helpful, because when I first heard this, the way I was looking at it is like, these are kind of the three unique aspects of what it means to be Yisrael. And I was, compartmentalization, I mean in a positive way here, trying to unmuddy the water. And I think in some ways I needed to unmuddy the water before being able to talk with you, so that you can say, now that you have clarity on some of these individual compartments, what happens when they do get mixed? Because we can't keep them unmixed forever because there is so much overlap. So thank you for that call forward to try to look at some of these intersections. So in no particular order, the first one is Medina and Eretz. Medina being state, government, Eretz being land. And this is where I'm fully aligned with you, that when it comes to, I'm going to plant crops, grow crops, harvest the crops, eat the food, and maybe share with my neighbors. That to me feels mostly in the Eretz bucket. I don't see a ton of overlap in other places. When you have a nation, though, you also have resources. Not just that you are in charge of distributing among your people, but you also have resources and borders that are shared with other nations. And in Israel, it's very, very complicated, in particular with water. Water access for Israel. Water access for people who are living in Gaza and the West Bank. Who controls those water aspects? If Israel is demarcated as not having any control over Gaza and the West Bank, then how do Palestinians get access to water on their own? Other kinds of resources, if it's electricity, if it's food, if it's crops, all of these kinds of resources, minerals, everything, what's Israel's state and governmental responsibility to distribute and allocate those resources first among the people within its borders? Because that's a governmental responsibility too, right? You're a government, you have natural resources. How do you distribute your natural wealth? With equality and equity, with access. And how do you do that when you are navigating this relationship? Because some of those resources also are adjacent to land which politically may or may not be yours, you do or don't want to be yours. When you're talking about Gaza and the West Bank, what's your obligation to the Palestinians? Are we meeting that obligation? Are we falling short of that obligation? I think these are all some of the complicated interplays between when a state and a government ultimately has control over and or access to resources, because then they are very much in a responsible place to distribute them equally and care for a broad group of people. Right? I have backyard chickens, right? So I get eggs, my family and I get to eat our eggs, right? So that's very my family centered, right? I don't have to worry about sharing land with my neighbors because it's property lines are my backyard, right? Now imagine if we had common backyards and we had common chickens, right? There are two people living there. There's one person living here with three people who come in and out a lot here. How many eggs do each of us get? How do we share, right? Now, who takes care of them? Now that's going to be easy for us to work out. Now you're a country. That's the huge complicated interplay I see between the Medina and the Eretz.
Fascinating. I mean, that's really, really helpful. And I mean, one thing you didn't mention that I think of right away are like roads or streets.
Yeah.
Which is a really big topic politically, that like this is a literal physical resource of your land, is like how do you move as a person, as a group across the land, across the Eretz, and this idea of having politically segregated roads because these territories of Gaza and the West Bank of Palestinian territories essentially, I mean Gaza is kind of cut off in a lot of ways geographically when you draw those Medina, the state boundaries.
It is.
How do they get in and out, or how do they
is.
actually travel? And
Yes.
so roads, I think, are a really clear example, along with all the other things you mentioned of water or minerals or agriculture. It seems to me that the backyard analogy is actually more straightforward than you made it seem, right? Because it isn't like you have a shared backyard. Because when we look at the state, I mean, this is where the framework gets helpful, and we can do this ideal, like let's just carve the third, like there's a state, right? Let's just pretend there's the political entity. There are clear political borders that the government of Israel is not the government of Palestine.
Right.
And of course, there's very complex legal issues about where the borders are, but it's just like having a backyard. It's like the city or the county or whoever draws these lines on a map, and they tell you and your neighbors, like, here's where your plot ends and your neighbor's plot begins, and if you have chickens on the other side of this line, they can't take your eggs. It seems to me that's exactly what's happening there, is that we have these legally or historically defined boundaries, potentially by multiple different kinds of governance actors, not all of which are the Medina, the state that we're talking about. Right? You might have like the UN saying one thing, the US saying another thing, the government of Israel saying one thing. And those borders only really become a problem when they interact with the actual land, with the eretz, with the physical ground upon which the crops grow and the streets run. And when those two things intersect, that's when you've got problems.
Yeah.
And what people often fight over. Yeah.
Yes, so you brought up two really good points. One in particular with the roads. Thank you so much, because as you said, the West Bank and Gaza, they are not landlocked.
Right.
And it's almost, you can't really circumnavigate around the current geographic land of
You mean
Israel.
from one to the other.
Correct.
Like you could like drive like from the West Bank like all the way around.
Right,
the
but then
southern
eventually,
tip,
but then eventually you get down through a lot, and then you have water, right? So then you do that, then you take a boat, and then you can eventually go through other countries, and they're clearly not, they're not navigable that way. So there needs to be a mechanism to get back and forth. That's complicated. Who's in charge of them? Who runs them? Who upkeeps them? Who does security? Then you have toll booths. Then you have just access, you have, what about free access into and out of, let's say, Gaza and Israel, for people who want to go back and forth? Whose responsibilities? We know that there's more free access one way than the other, right? All of these things, so that's where all of them gets complicated. And now let's take the backyard chicken analogy. I would venture to say, in the case of my neighbors and me, no issues. Like, I do have a fence, we have a tree over there, we could figure things out. If we wanted to share chickens, I actually talked about sharing chickens with my neighbors to this side, where maybe we would build like adjacent coops, because you can have a maximum of 4 chickens. So technically I'd have 4 chickens, they'd have 4 chickens, and then there'd be like a little chicken door in between, so you can go back and forth. If you are representing the city of Glendale, Wisconsin, please delete the past 10 seconds from your memory.
It doesn't actually look like that back there.
Hypothetically.
There's only 4 chickens.
Exactly. You've seen, right. It's really complicated hiding 2 chickens anytime somebody comes over, just for the optics. Right, but in that case, we would work it out. There are just simply no issues. Now imagine that the lines that we have for our houses are set by the city. Let's say you have a great relationship with the city. The person who runs the city and who does all of this stuff is your best friends. They're best friends with you. You get along great. You work together. You've thrown so much business their way, and all above board, right? And we've had some conflicts. Nothing malicious, nothing nefarious. We've just been butting heads. We see zoning things differently, so we've kind of been on other sides of the debate from time to time. And just in terms of business and contracts, we tend to be more vying for the same thing than collaborators. All above board. We can all sit and hang out together, schmooze together. We all get along great. Now they're the ones setting the borders. Okay, now imagine that your positive relationship with them is not so above board. Underhand, you do wink, wink, nod, nod, handshake deals. And we've had public fights. We're going back and forth. We've sued each other a ton of times. Here are the borders. You're going to say, these are fantastic. I'm going to say, absolutely not. I don't trust the borders. Now I have to honor the borders set by your buddy who's already not my buddy. How am I going to trust your borders? Now if there's a dispute, do I want to go to them?
Right.
Or does each of us trust them when the dispute's in our favor, and then undermine them when the dispute's against us? What if each of us says, back in my day, what's now your garage used to be land on my property. And you say, back in my day, what's now your south wing of the house used to actually be on my land. Or what if we say, look, you know what? I remember my grandparents and your grandparents used to they just built two houses on this land. They would just kind of go hang out in and out of each other's houses all the time, which would be far more idyllic than is representative of the current land in the Middle East, right? Relationships were never that good. But even in that case, we can see how you and I might get territorial.
Yeah.
That happens. Now take an unbelievably complicated history in what's now Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. Unbelievably complicated. Now try to navigate borders and land and resources and claims and the UN. Hugely complicated relationship there too. Mm-hmm. I mean, fundamentally, there's no trust. Understandably, there's no trust. My neighbors and I are going to figure it out. For the most part, I think the US and Canada will figure things out. Because for the most part, there's trust. There isn't trust there. I can understand why. It's going to be that much more, almost infinitely impossible to navigate much more complicated resources when it's just not such a clear border, and when access to these resources tends to be disproportionately toward one place than the other.
Right. I mean, then the inequities just build on themselves, that if you have more power, if you're better friends with the guy at the city who draws the borders, then it just snowballs and you get more and more and more. Yeah, that's interesting.
And just to be very, very clear, I'm not making absolute one-to-one comparisons between you, me, and a hypothetical person here and what's going on in the Middle East, right? Because it's a much different relationship with them and people in power and other communities and relationships of power. This was just a trite example. So don't extrapolate one to the other, just to be very, very clear.
But I think there are real parallels there where when you talk about, say, like Israeli settlers moving into territory that is, political entities have said that doesn't belong to you. Mm-hmm. When they move there, a lot of what you hear in the news is, say, like burning down like orchards or olive trees or whatever the natural resources are on, like that come from the land that are like just inherently entangled with the politics of where the states draw their borders.
Which is the perfect segue. I literally have it in my notes here, which is the perfect. I know, Ben hasn't seen my notes. This is the perfect segue, right? To what I see as the intersection between Medina and Am. Medina, again, being state, Am being people.
Okay.
And in many ways, I would liken this to what modern political Zionism became.
Okay.
The idea that the people of Israel, the Jewish people, should be they should have governmental control over the geography of what is now Israel. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
So that I see as the entity of political Zionism. And I'm trying to say this in a valence neutral way. I'm not, because Zionism and nationalism, there's a relationship between those. That's probably a separate video. I'm not trying to suggest superiority here. I'm just trying to suggest that within the geographic borders of Israel, whatever those borders are, that's where the people of Israel and what the people of Israel should be and should have a say in governing and running. And this, to me, kind of goes all the way back to the Tanakh, to the Bible. I do not consider the Tanakh as a primary source document from a historical perspective.
Sure.
Some people do. Some Jews do. Some people who are not Jewish do. I just want to put out there, I do not consider it a primary source document. And if we were to look at the Bible, at the Tanakh, either as a primary source document or as a determinist document for the Jewish people, right? The Jewish people are supposed to be in the land of Israel all the way from the sea all the way to the Jordan River. Mm-hmm. And if you look later in the Tanakh, King David greatly expanded the realm.
It was called Judea at the time?
Yeah, greatly expanded it. There are people now, and I'm guessing a lot of them might be some of the more fervent settlers, who might even suggest that the true domain of Israel goes all the way to the David dynasty. So a lot of times the Medina and the Am is trying to make political the nationhood of the Jewish people in this geographic land and region. You took a huge deep breath there.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. Because again, we come back to that word nation.
Yep.
And there's something very interesting about the concept. I remember I took a class when I was at UWM about nationhood and where this idea comes from. What does it mean? And a lot of times it does start with the geopolitical boundaries of a country, a land upon which a people live. But it almost always, and I think it's a part of what nationhood means, it always expands in a more abstract realm.
Right.
That a person who lives in that geopolitical boundary on that land remains a part of the nation, even if they move somewhere else, even if they renounce their citizenship of the geopolitical entity that governs that land. They still often associate themselves with that nation.
Yep.
And I think this is true not just of Jews, but of most people and places. That even if I left the United States permanently and renounced my citizenship, I'd probably always to some degree be an American.
Right.
At least to the people that I lived around in that other country or in that other place.
Right.
So that's a very clear description. I appreciate that. The big sigh, though.
But let me just jump onto that for a moment. Then I want to hit the big sigh. Which is, so when I lived in New York for 12 years, I never considered myself a New Yorker.
Right.
I always considered myself a Wisconsinite.
Right.
Right? Born and raised here in Wisconsin. Love Milwaukee. Everyone should come visit Wisconsin. Come move to Wisconsin. I will take you around. I love this city and state.
Don't come here. It's terrible. We don't. I want it to just be ours.
Oh, I know. When Door County was featured in national magazines, everyone's like, "Shh! Don't tell the country about it. That's our specialty." Anyway,
great. There's not a lot of us here.
Right. Oh my gosh, that cake looks terrible. You shouldn't have any of it. Right. So yeah, when I lived in New York, I still consider myself a Wisconsinite. Right? What does it mean to be American? Is that an ideology? Is that citizenship? Is that U.S.? Is that U.S., Canada, Mexico? Is that U.S., Canada, Mexico, Central America, South America? Right? So we have all of these kind of things, and these can all be done in a healthy way. Right? What does that mean when I say I'm American? Am I representing two continents? One continent? This a single country? Am I a Wisconsinite? Am I disavowing New York? Right? So, and all these can be healthy, positive conversations. And when it's far more complicated, of course, it can be more. I don't know if that's where the sigh was going to come from. Where was the sigh coming from?
Well, from the complication of it's very clear when you say it in terms of nationhood, but what we're talking about is the intersection of the people and the states, or of Medina and right? That's, I think about the Black Israelites, for example, who are always downtown, just hanging out, talking about whatever they talk about. And their main thing is that it's a historical argument that way back in the day, I don't know if it's from the dynasty of David or whenever, that there was a lost tribe that essentially turned into black people or African Americans in the United States, and that Jews, as we popularly describe them and talk about them, like you or I, are fakes or false Jews, and that the real Jews, the real people, the real are black people in the United States, African Americans, and that therefore they should be the ones in control of the political entity of Israel.
Right.
And that this intersection, that I think is well described by that position of the Black Israelites.
Yep.
Also, arguably, the thing that the conflict is currently centered around, at least in the popular media.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's the other big sigh there. It's that's really the problem that at least, I don't think it's the problem, but I think it is the problem that we often talk about when we talk about conflict there.
Once again, your transition is so prescient, because what I was about to say is, from my perspective of all the kind of various intersections, this is the most difficult one, complicated, contentious one. Right? Both internally within the Jewish and Israel communities, and also nationally, politically, and interdependently. This, I think, is by far the most complicated one, which was my transition, because I think probably the least complicated one would be the overlap between Eretz and Am, which is land and people. Part of what it means to be Jewish, go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, to Adam and Eve, is that part of our job is to be protectors of and shepherds of the land. It's the Medina, which is going to define where that land is and what that land is. But part of our responsibilities as Jews, and I would suggest our collective responsibilities, but part of our responsibilities as Jews, as an Am, is to protect the land and look after it, to care for it. Right? We're agriculturalists by nature, not just Jewish people in general, but certainly the Jewish people are agriculturalists by nature. We're supposed to look after the Garden of Eden, after the animals, right? Care for the land, right? We as Jews are supposed to be in dynamic relationship with God, dynamic relationship with ourselves, dynamic relationship with each other, and dynamic relationship with the land, right? We are supposed to look out for the land. My suspicion is that's going to be the least complicated and least controversial one. To say that as human beings, part of our religious charge and mandate, or as Jews, part of our religious charge and mandate is to look after the land in which we live and which provides so much for us.
It's fascinating because I hear what you're saying in terms of least controversial when we talk about like the conflict in the Middle East or a war between Israel and Palestine or Israel and Lebanon or whoever. But I don't think it's any less controversial than the other intersections writ large.
How so?
When you zoom out of the context. I mean, because what we're talking about really is Israel as a concept. And in this case, I would agree with you, that is almost never touched on. We almost never talk about like what I think you're saying is like environmental factors of like, you know, just the people, anyone who lives there, whether they're Jew or Arab or anyone else, like should take care of the place that they come from. And there's a lot of like farming practices that come from the Bible or the Torah that like tell you here's how you farm sustainably and like you say agriculturalists from the very beginning. So I don't think there's anything controversial when you talk about like the actual war that's happening right now. However, I do think that as a society, a global society, this is one of the most controversial topics like that we have in terms of climate change or global warming or sustainable farming practices or our consumption habits. You talked about water as it relates to the intersection between the land and the state, but this is also true as it relates to the land and the people, right?
Yes, and I think your comments are coming from a place of a presupposition that caring for the land by definition means sustainable, the green movement, those kinds of things. I don't know of any Jews who would say, as a Jew, I have no obligation to the land and I can destroy it and use it wantonly. I don't know of any Jew who would say that. I believe Jews would say, well, of course we have an obligation to look after this earth and this world. Now, the questions you're bringing up is, what does that mean? How do we do it? Does that mean we have a mandate for sustainability? If so, what is sustainability? What's the minimum that we should do? What's the maximum that we should do? Is your definition of sustainability different from mine? Is sustainability the same thing as caring for the land? Those could be entirely different things, and that could be you trying to transplant and impose sustainability onto something that doesn't presume sustainability. So I'm separating this for the moment, the relationship between the Jewish people and the land. I'm separating that from anything that has to do with sustainability, with resource conservation, separating it entirely. As Jews, our responsibility is to care for this land. Now, the political conversations that you're bringing up and the ethical ones you're bringing up is a question of how. That we are supposed to, I don't know of any Jews who would say, as a Jew, I don't have to care at all about the earth. And I can do whatever I want, I can burn it up if I want to. I don't know of any Jew who would say that. how we do it, what that means individually, what that means collectively, that's, I think, the conversation that is definitely complicated. That the relationship exists, I don't think is controversial.
I can agree with that. I think and you're right, the broader contexts of like a global capitalist society are important, but they are background noise for this conversation. And I think you're right that when we zoom into just the Venn diagram that we're looking at here, and we talk about the overlap between the people, not as a global community, but just as a Jewish community, which does span the entire globe, right? But we talk about the people and its relationship to the land. Yes, you're right. There is almost no controversy there at all. And in terms of should we, yes, like you said. How do we do that? A little more controversial. But even then, you're probably right.
And there's some basics, right? Because again, you go back to the Torah and you're supposed to have the Shemitah. Like every 7 years, your land is supposed to lie fallow. Right. What they did in practice is they apportioned their land into 7 different parts.
Right.
And then in year 1, part 1 would lie fallow. In year 2, part 2. In year 3. And then, obviously, there's always these legal loopholes, but let's presume the purity of that. So, again, the idea that we as a Jewish people leave parts of our land just to lie fallow, and then those resources, now we're going into other things, but those resources theoretically are hefty, they're ownerless. Anyone who is hungry can come take from whatever grows in that fallow land, right? That now we're getting to that final intersection.
I was just going to say this is
right. That's going to be
you did the segue
pivot.
to the last one, yeah.
But that idea that we have a relationship with the land, I think is, and by the way, I would say in modern times the notion that the Jewish people definitely should have a geopolitical relationship with the borders and country of Israel, I think is far more controversial. That's what we're talking about.
Right.
What's the relationship between Am and Medina?
Yeah.
You and I live in this country. We're born here in this country. What voice do we have? Should we have? Should we not have in the running of the government?
Right.
Should the Jewish people even have a national government of their own? Right? That's not a question a lot of Jews want to even ask. And it's a lot of questions that, for a lot of Jews, the starting point is, yes, now we can debate everything else. And there are a great number and a growing number of Jews who are really wondering if that's the case, and certainly doubting that it should be the case. Right? So that's why I'm saying that Medina and Am is far more complicated, because I don't think it's a presumption among the Jewish community everywhere that Jewish people should have a Jewish religious land of their own. And for those who do believe they should, what's the responsibilities? That's where I think it's controversial and complicated. So that's where I see the distinction between Am and Medina, between people and government, versus people and land, where if I have land in my backyard, I have some Jewish obligations to my land.
I see. And so when we use the word Zionism, that isn't really applicable to the Eretz or the land and the people.
Well, in this context, I used political Zionism within Medina and Am. There are many, many, many forms of Zionism. In fact, in the early 1800s, 1820s to 40s, in Germany, German Jews were suggesting that Israel is no longer the Zion dream, that the Zion ideal would be in Germany.
As a political entity? Or
they were saying Zionism is the Zionist ideal is in Germany.
So this is what it might look like for
that would
the land and the people.
So that would not be political Zionism. That would be an entirely different form of Zionism.
Gotcha.
Right?
So that's
and
not
I don't think that's land. I think that's I mean that's a different that's a different kind of state, because now you are talking about being a nation within a nation. Right? The German Jews are really Germans.
Yeah.
Right? A people within a nation that has its own unique culture and some practices, and really is German first. We're Germans who are Jewish, as opposed to Jews living in Germany. This is one of these classic questions that was asked when we were kids in religious school and everything. Are you a Jewish American or an American Jew? I always loathed that question, because I think it creates a false binary.
Sure, yeah.
Right? I get why teachers ask, because it's one of these fascinating, but like, that's where it gets so muddied and complicated, right? And that's what German Jews in the early 1800s were saying. They made it not complicated. We reject Israel as part of Zionism.
Interesting.
In fact, Theodor Herzl, his initial vision for the Jewish country was in Uganda, because there was land available. And when he presented that, many, if not most of the Jewish leaders says, if we're going to have a country, how could it not be in Israel? Which is the transition to Medina Eretz and Am, right? To state, to land, and Am. We can go back all the way to the Tanakh again, to the Torah once again, right? And to theology. There's the theology beginning in the book of Deuteronomy and moving through the early section of prophets, that if the Israelite people, effectively the Am, if the people obey God's laws, the reward would be rain. Rain falls, crops grow, you have food. If you disobey God's law, and you will remain in control of the geopolitical land of Israel. If you disobey God, according to the Deuteronomic theology, what came with the Deuteronomy and prophets, then the rains will stop, the land will not produce food, and foreign countries will come and take over the governance of Israel, to the point that you might even be kicked out of the land of Israel, up until you've repented, changed your ways, and then you will be turned. This is new information for you.
Yeah.
I can see your eyes bugging out.
Yeah,
right? This was like a cartoon moment with
I
like
see
the
where
eyes.
you're going, yeah.
Right. So theologically, the land is an agent of reward and punishment, and the control of Israel is a reward and punishment for the Israelites and whether they are obeying or disobeying God's laws. This is thousands of years ago. Moving forward a little bit, Yehuda Halevi wrote the Kuzari, and one of his, the end of his life came on his journey to Israel. He ultimately believed he had to move to Israel, because Jewish fulfillment in its entirety can only be in the land of Israel. Because there's such a deep connection between Jewish, Israel, land, God, practice, religion, people, everything. You can only be a fully complete Jew if you're living in the land of Israel. Indeed, there a great number of the mitzvot, the commandments, can only be done in the land of Israel. So one of his arguments is, if there are commandments that I cannot do because I live outside of Israel, I can't be a full Jew.
Can you give me an example of one of those?
Probably.
Think about it. Keep talking.
Yes, thank you. So many are flooding to mind at the moment that we will certainly ask my social media person to edit this out. No, that's okay. I'm sure there are examples, and I don't have one. I do have a computer, so in a moment we can do a quick Google search.
I don't use Google anymore.
Okay, we'll...
Ecosia. You know Ecosia?
No, because I'm sure there's a geopolitical, ethical interplay there too,
yes.
which you will fill me in in a
that.
different video.
Anyways.
Yes, I get to learn and grow, no pun intended when you're talking about agriculture, but I get to learn and grow. So that's some research that we will do.
Ecosia plants a tree every time you do a search.
Really?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. So there you go.
That's interesting, because the JNF, right?
That's right.
The Jewish National Fund is very much about planting trees,
Yep.
right? So
Anyways,
so Yehuda Halevi believed that the fulfillment of being Jews could only happen in Israel. And by the way, I'm not putting any negative valence on that. The first one, I could see your eyes bugging out. The way Halevi is framing it doesn't quite have that triggering reaction, right? Now, in a more modern context, Yom Kippur is considered a fast day. The Day of Atonement is considered a fast day. All the other fast days in Judaism are connected with the political sovereignty in the land of Israel. Tisha B'Av, right, which is considered the national Jewish day of mourning, is the destruction of the temples, which also symbolizes the loss of geopolitical control of the governance of Israel, and was accompanied by a period of living outside of the land. After the destruction of the first temple, for about 70 years, after the destruction of the second temple, about 1900 years, up until 1948. A lot of the minor fasts are like the breach of the walls, right? So a lot of these fasts are connected with the geopolitical sovereignty of the land. So here's a question which one of my teachers at Mechon Shechter, when I was studying in Jerusalem, Moshe Benovitz, posed, and I have fully embraced, which is, if Jews are now in geopolitical control of the land of Israel, put aside the complicated and controversial question for many of whether they should be.
Sure.
Right? But if Jews are, should we still be fasting on these days? Because if these days are to commemorate the loss of control, in fact, in prophets, there's actually one verse which says, I will turn your days of mourning into days of gladness, and your days of, despondence into days of celebration. Rashi, the preeminent Bible commentator, Rashi says, when Jews are back in control and sovereignty of the land of Israel, that's what it means, that I will turn your days of sadness into gladness. So if we accept that, then really on what's considered fast days, we should be having parties. We should effectively be having Israel Independence Days throughout the year. Some people are going to say that we should still keep Tisha B'Av as a national day of mourning to commemorate the tragedies that befell. That, I think, is more of a religious, theological question. But it's a compelling question that so many of our religious practices are connected with geopolitical control and being a people. So should we still be fasting on fast days? We don't need to answer that. What I'm saying is this is the interplay between the land, the people, and the governance. Right? All of these things embed, and we can have this conversation from a religious aspect, hopefully a bit removed for the most part from the complexities of the state and people, right? Because this is much more of a religious conversation. But still, the theology is potentially complicated when your eyes were bugging out, all the way talking about the fulfillment of our aspects of Jews, back to should we continue to fast, right? These are some of the intersections between all of them, some of them in ways, and some of them, I think, in more healthy, curious ways.
That's fascinating. And I mean, I think the very center of this diagram is where the most controversy occurs, because it integrates all of the controversy of the other intersections into one giant, messy. In some ways, it's almost a little cleaner when you put it all together, but cleaner in the sense of the controversy is clearer. Right?
Exactly.
My eyes were bugging out when you said that, because that, I mean, I assume this is what you meant when you said it, that strongly suggests that, like, conflict of this sort is theological in nature, that there is a divine intervention happening when you are being besieged by enemies, that, like, the people, the political entity, have brought this upon themselves by not being holy enough, by not, like, doing what God is saying, and that the land and the political entity are a threat because of divine retribution. That is an eye-bugging moment right there of, like, how can you even... Is that conversation being had anywhere?
Anywhere, I'm sure.
That's a terrifying...
Anywhere, absolutely. Probably not in any Jewish circle that you and I are wondering. Look, there was a famous rabbi who said that the Holocaust, the Shoah, was punishment by God for Jews who were violating Shabbat.
Wow.
So yes, that conversation is happening.
Sure.
Probably not in most of our circles, and probably not in most people who are watching.
Sure.
I could be wrong. Probably
leave
not.
a comment if you're having this conversation somewhere.
Right. Or there might be a conversation about it without necessarily what I would call the extremist of that literalist.
Sure.
God uses the
Yeah,
right.
like the hurricane hit your state because you have gay people there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the conversation still might be happening of if we as a Jewish people disobey God's teachings, how does God bring consequence to us? And is the land in some ways part of that consequence? Now, to take it a little bit away from the extremism, in the Mishnah, when there was a drought, the response was to fast. Because by fasting, the idea is to connect once again with yourselves, to look inward. That's the point of the fast. And then they're saying if there's a drought, that must mean that we as a Jewish people are not doing what we're supposed to do. So we're going to fast, help us figure out exactly what we're doing wrong. As a result, we can then change our ways, and then the drought is going to end. And a drought is not coincidental. A drought is brought by God. Now, I'm guessing that's a theology that neither you nor I ascribe to. That being said, it's probably far less eye-bugging than the really stark way it's presented in the Torah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I don't, you know me, I'm not a religious Jew by any
Right.
means, and so I can't say I ascribe to any theology, but I don't disagree with the response to hardship being to reflect on what my role in it
Absolutely.
is. I mean, this is what I love about Judaism and the way that you practice and teach it is
Yes.
that I don't have to believe in God or even a theology to say that's a great idea. Actually,
Right.
it prepares you for the potential of the drought turning into a famine.
Yeah.
It gets your body ready for it. Like turns your mind to reflect on like how I am causing this potentially by not having
Yes.
sustainable farming practices or whatever it is.
Yes.
And it really gives you an agency, even though it is something happening to you.
Yes.
It's like how does my behavior and my actions play a role in what's happening around? I love it personally.
Thank you. I mean, you and I fundamentally agree on that.
Yeah.
And I'm a believer that if there's conflict between two people, my first responsibility is to look inward.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas most of the time, if there's conflict, I'm likely to say, hey, Ben, here's what I'd like you to reflect on. Even if we're saying in a loving,
Right.
kind, embracing way, it's nature to say, I'd love you to reflect on this for a little bit, please. As opposed to saying, you know what? I'm not talking to you right now. I got to figure out what I'm doing here.
Right.
And by the way, the result of that introspection might be, I'm actually pretty proud of the choices I made.
Yeah.
I'm not perfect, but I'm actually proud of them overall. That's a fair response. The initial response should be looking inward. This is what we're talking about. This is what fasting is. Where I think we might not, I think we'd be on the same page, is that the cause of what's going on in the world is God created and driven.
Right. Right.
Right. So in other words, if we see a natural disaster, you and I might say, okay, what have we as an individual, as a country, as a people done to create a world in which this natural disaster happened? One response might be actually not that much.
Right.
This was just happened.
Sometimes meteors just fly
It
out
might
of outer
be,
space, yeah.
okay, we've done some things and we have some things we can work on, and I don't know that we need to prioritize our efforts. Or it could be, what have we done?
Right.
Right? That's what I think we would align. That's what Judaism helps us do. That's what fasting helps us do, is this introspection. That's the point of the high holidays. Right? Which is something your parents very much have helped me see based on your family practice for Rosh Hashanah, for high holidays. You have no idea what I'm talking about?
No.
You know, your parents like bike? They take like I thought they said they did this with you. Like instead of going to services, they would take like a bike trip
Probably when I was much
up
younger.
north, and then you would like do like a day of reflection and
I've repressed all of the
Oh.
Jewish practice in my life.
that to me, I always thought that was inspirational.
I mean,
Right?
my
'Cause you-
parents have taught me some wonderful things, even if I don't remember the
Yeah.
details of them.
Yeah, but to say repressing, but like you take like a bike trip on high holidays. You would go as a family. You would sit at the beach, and then you would reflect on the year that's passed and what things you want to do in the year ahead. I mean, that to me sounds beautiful.
Yeah.
It sounds very non-normative for what we talk about with
Right.
high holidays.
Right.
And I love it. I think that's such a beautiful embodiment of the high holidays. but that's all the interpersonal reflection. And I don't mean this, I don't know your parents' theology, so I'm not making a statement. I don't presume that that's theologically driven either.
Right.
Right? It might be. So in that sense, when we talk about reflection as something Judaism offers us, yes, with this intersection, there's the theology that's connected to.
And this is where the real controversy is, right?
Yep.
That's like when we talk about a religious ethnostate,
Mm-hmm.
which is functionally the middle circle, or the intersection of all three of these circles in the Venn diagram is like, that's it right there, right? It's like religious ethnostate of Israel. And that, I think, is something that is really hard to talk about because of how muddy the intersections between these things are. And that, like, some of my favorite thinkers just straight up, they just come out and say it, is that, like, religious ethnostates are bad.
Yes.
No matter where they are, no matter who they are, no matter what
Yes.
theology it is.
Yes.
And I think that is an unfortunately controversial thing to say. I agree with that statement. I do not think a religious ethnostate is right in any case. I wouldn't want Sharia law. I wouldn't want the Tanakh or the Torah to be the thing that's driving the governance issues, or even the way that we manage our land, right?
Yeah.
Like, even if there are some good things in there, like we talked about, that intersection between the people and the land, like the Torah does have a lot of really helpful things to teach us about that.
Right.
And as soon as that becomes the law of the land, then you have a problem. As soon as it even becomes more than just a vague guiding principle, it becomes very problematic, because there are other people in the world. There honestly aren't that many Jews when you look at global population. And even in Israel, there are many different, it's a pretty diverse place. And you end up with a lot of discrimination and segregation and all sorts of problems at the center here.
And I think there's a line going from, let's say the Torah is the foundational principle, to the Torah is the prescriptive principle.
Mm-hmm.
There's a line somewhere there. And some people might not even be comfortable with foundational principle, but foundational does not imply it is the only or even the best.
Right.
This is where we start and base things off of. And we have all the flexibility to pivot when we choose to. Right? It's not so easy to pivot from foundational, but that's embedded somewhere. And for some, foundational might even be too far. But I think there's a clear line between a foundational principle and prescriptive, or predetermined, or this is the basis of it. And everything that we do has to fit within this. Right? And that's, I think, the part that's difficult for you, that you're bringing up, that a lot of people are saying. It's one thing for Jewish law and Jewish teachings and Jewish wisdom to infuse and to guide practices within the current country of Israel. It's another for it to be prescribing everything. And it's another for it to be the practice.
Right.
Right? That's where it gets complicated. In the United States, Christmas is a national holiday.
Right, yeah.
In Israel, people don't work on Yom Kippur. Are both of those okay?
Right.
Are neither of those okay? Right? Because in theory, if one is going to suggest that Yom Kippur should not be essentially a day off in Israel, Christmas should not be a day off here, I'm not suggesting that should be the case. Or it could be the case that Christmas is not an official day off. We do as a country recognize that the vast majority of the highest number of people who celebrate a holiday celebrate Christmas. So as a kindness, we are going to make it a non-required work day for anyone who would like to choose not to work. This is now way beyond any legal training I have, but these are really fundamental questions, right? We look at other countries in the Middle East where nationalism does seem to be the dominant practice for how the countries are managed. And if we're going to say that shouldn't be the case, that nationalism there is bad, shouldn't we extend that to Israel? But Israel's different.
Right.
But Israel's different because Jews have been persecuted throughout time. This is the one safe place that Jews have. Right? Think of the terror that happened in Amsterdam. Israel sent helicopters to bring the Jews and the Israelis home. Right? If you don't have a country of Israel, do you get to... Right? I mean, this is where there's so much complication. And what's the relationship between I don't remember the word you used, a phrase which also people would say is nationalism.
Oh, yes. Yeah, you're talking about like a religious ethno-state.
Yes. What's the relation between religious ethno-state nationalism and what I have been calling political Zionism? Because you're potentially bringing forward the claim, if not the possibility, if not the claim, that it shouldn't be a religious ethno-state.
Yes.
That it shouldn't be a nationalistic state in that definition of nationalism, and that in that understanding of political Zionism, Israel shouldn't exist.
Right.
Right? So then when people say, I'm anti-Zionist, I don't mean this flippantly, I don't know what they mean.
Right.
Does that mean that the political Zionist, nationalistic, religious ethno-state of Israel should not exist? Question mark. Does that mean that Jews should not have a homeland?
Right, right.
Does that mean that there should be a country of Israel in which Yom Kippur is not the day off? Does that mean that you don't believe that Jews should have a country of Israel? Or does that mean that you believe that we as Jews have been sinning and do not merit having the country of Israel because we haven't earned it and we should still be in exile?
Yeah. Wow.
And there are people who would say they're anti-Zionist for that reason.
It's fascinating.
So when someone says I'm anti-Zionist, I don't know what that means.
Right.
I really don't.
Yeah.
When someone says I'm Zionist, I don't know what that means. Because there are multiple forms of Zionism. Right? There are multiple forms of Zionism. That's a very, very separate video.
Yeah, we could do a whole video about
right,
like...
right. But there are forms of Zionism which are not predominant forms, which do really distinguish outside of political Zionism. So if anti-Zionism means really narrowly anti a nationalistic religious ethno-state, I think that's controversial and conversationable. That's not a word. Discussable, right? Right? That's controversial, and I think there's room for conversation within that.
Yes. Yeah.
I think when people say or hear anti-Zionist, we tend to think that it means that that Israel shouldn't exist.
Right.
And that is, I think, a hard line for many, many, many Jews. The right of Israel to exist, and since it exists, the right of Israel to defend itself.
Right.
And someone might be anti-nationalist and might agree with that. And they might disagree with how Israel right now is embodying that right to exist. Right? So that's where it gets so muddied right now. Because when someone says I'm Zionist or anti-Zionist, I don't know what that means. And something that I haven't really said publicly, but I'm saying publicly more and more, is when people say I stand with Israel, I don't know what that means. Because I don't know what Israel means.
Right.
Are you talking about Eretz, Medina, two of the three, or all three of them? And what I'm about to say probably, I don't want to presume, but I suspect it might not land well for a lot of people, and I'm happy to talk more. Post October 7th within the Jewish community, when we were hearing Free Palestine, one of the things that we tried to say within the Jewish community is what we should do is say, what does that mean to you, Free Palestine?
Right, right.
Like I said before, I think whenever there's conflict, we should be doing the internal work first. Before we ask someone else, what does Free Palestine mean? I think we need to do the introspection. What does I stand with Israel mean? And I don't mean this as a negative. I don't think we as individual Jews, for the most part, and we as a Jewish community, really have done this deep introspection. It's so muddied and so complicated, and it's so much safer so often to simply say, I stand with Israel. Israel has a right to exist and defend itself, and not engage with what does that mean. And by the way, that doesn't presuppose that a Jewish nation state of Israel is bad or wrong. I'm not making any presuppositions. That might be the conclusion that individuals and or we as a community come to. Okay, have we really done that introspection? Or if we are a Jewish nationalist state, what obligations do we have to other people living there and to people adjacent to us when we also control some of the resources?
Right.
Are we meeting those obligations? Is it okay to not completely meet them, but not really not meet them? Is that a sufficient standard? Do we have to go above and beyond? Or, at its core, should Israel as a safe haven for Jews throughout all time, as that kind of geopolitical entity exist, but maybe not have a government? And I know this is complicated because a lot of the same people who are saying that Israel should exist in this geopolitical sense are entirely turned off by Israel because of the religious fervor that would make someone like me not considered a rabbi there.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, we advocate for Israel as it is, and on the other hand, don't advocate, and we intertwine here Medina, Eretz, and Am in a way that we don't necessarily want to. I am not trying to admonish us for not having reconciled all of these. Because truthfully, this is a 70-year conversation, right? I mean, country was reformed in 1948. So we're really in the second generation of trying to figure out what this means for ourselves and then to interplay in a larger world.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think these are simple. I'm not trying to minimize them. Of course, these are brutally complicated. It's no shock that we're still trying to figure it out. And then as we see things that work great, and as we see the things that don't work, who's responsible for correcting? Who's responsible for bringing that? Do we say that publicly? Do we say that in whispers to each other? How do we advocate? How do we help? We're still trying to work all of this out.
Yeah.
Right? You and I are in a new relationship, whatever that is, and we're still trying to figure out what that means. How often do we hang out? How often do we text? Do we call? Can I just stop by your house? Am I allowed to say, hey, I know it's awkward being adults, but I really like you? Which is actually something I do say a lot, right? Like, but it feels awkward. Like, I like you. Like, what an awkward thing to say. We aren't trained to say that. When can we say I like you?
Right.
Right? When we're trying to figure out new relationships, right? Like, oh my gosh, we just hung out a couple of times. Like, I really want to go do this with you again. Like, again, even, and it doesn't have to be like a relationship. It could just be a friendship. Like, when can I first text and call? These are like real questions, which you'd think get easier when we're adults and don't. And we're just two people who only have good intentions, and there's only positive things between us. Now imagine you're this Jewish people, whatever that means, trying to navigate this country of Israel that hasn't existed for 1900 years. Of course it's going to be complicated. Of course we don't yet have clarity over how we see ourselves. And if that's the case, I am so not surprised that we're not sure how we want and what we expect the world and our allies to do. Because we don't know who we are entirely. And that's okay. If I don't know who I am, it's going to be hard for you to engage with me. Or for me to have clear expectations of you as a friend, partner, cousin, colleague, how to engage if I don't know what my wants and needs are.
Mm-hmm.
And if that isn't complicated enough, are we allowed to be fluid? When I say I am a Jew, or I am an Israel, and today I might just mean Am, tomorrow am I allowed to mean Medina plus Eretz but not Am, and the next day can mean I mean all three? Am I allowed to be fluid? Or is it, I don't want to say is it not allowed, but is identity in some of these regards a little bit more defined? And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying fluidity is good or bad. I'm not saying definition is good or bad. At what point is constant fluidity tantamount to saying I can be anything or nothing at my whim? Which also I don't think helps dialogue, conversations, health, healing, and growth. Right? So when can we be fluid or not? As a Jew, an Israelite, Israel, they're just so intertwined. And part of the reason I'm so grateful that you suggested I make this video is because I think it helps me, for the moment, put aside some of these inconceivable and certainly seemingly unsolvable conflicts and struggles going on. Because so often, I think you, and we don't even know where to begin.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think there's a lot of shared vision for what the outcome would be. And I'm willing to bet that most Israelis and most Jews and most Palestinians and most Arabs and most Muslims, for the most part, we could ultimately get to a shared vision. I think there's trust about who has the capacity to implement it. But beyond that, it's such an overwhelming, impossible thing of how do we get there, who starts, who does what, that it's incapacitating. And I think this conversation of how do I really see myself as I stand with Israel? Am I talking Medina alone, Eretz alone, Am alone? Am I talking about Medina plus Am, Eretz plus Am, Medina plus Eretz? Am I talking about all three? And I didn't put you on the spot, which I was going to. I didn't think of a good example of someone who's outside the Venn diagram. I mean, I can think there's someone who's not Jewish in a religious realm and not connected with Israel in a life realm as outside the Venn diagram, which, by the way, is not a good or bad thing, right? I could just see that being, but I haven't found like an intersection within the broad Jewish community who's not there, unless maybe you are someone who's not Jewish, has no connection with Israel, and who is still interested in the state of Jewish in Israel and all of that. But I don't have a great example of someone outside of the Venn diagram entirely who's likely watching this video.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Right, I don't think so either.
But I would, if you didn't know you were Jewish, if you grew up in a different community, you had Jewish ancestry and you just didn't know, that's the only thing I can think of that would be like...
Right, and you're probably not watching this video, which is okay, right? So this for me is so helpful, Ben, that you asked me to do this and think about all this, because it gives me a framework to start trying to figure out, where do I see myself? Do I define myself one way, multiple ways, all of them? Do I prioritize? Do sometimes I go back and forth? Which is driven by emotion, right? Sometimes Jews might turn to God when their lives are at their worst. God, I know I haven't talked to you every day. I know I haven't thanked you for everything. Excuse me, today I could really use your help. Right? Hey, Ben, I know we haven't talked in a couple of months. Today things are really, really going poorly, and I know you've been helpful in the past. I hope it's okay that I'm calling you up, even though I haven't called in recently just to check in. Right? Sometimes it's the reverse. Ben, I know we haven't talked in a while. I have such great news and I want to share it with you. Are we allowed to go back and forth? Allowed, wrong word. But how much fluidity is healthy? Where do I stand? Do I find myself in one or multiple? And I think this is a conversation that we can start to really have. Where do you see yourself in this Venn diagram? Where do you want to be seen? What do you see your role is? Do you think that some are actually more okay, some of these places, than others? Do you think some are actually unhealthy or wrong? These, I think, are conversations we can have and debate, which removes some of the anxiety and triggers of what's going on, and still allow for us to have these fundamental, foundational, introspective conversations, which will then begin that process of, okay, now that I know who you are and where you're coming from, now that I've started to understand who I am and where I'm coming from, where do we align in terms of our hopes and process, and where do we not necessarily align? Where we align, can we walk together? When we don't align, can we simply say, good luck, I wish you well? Or do we say, I'd love an hour to convince you, and I'll give you 30 minutes to convince me, right? Or do we say, because we don't align here, I'm not so comfortable walking with you there? But all of a sudden, these feel healthier, even if we still don't agree on anything, than with the current state of where we're at right now, which is, I stand with, I don't stand with. I'm for, I'm against. So that's what you've really helped me unpack.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you making the video, because I
You're
think,
welcome.
like, to pull some principles from the conversation, like the responsibility is with everyone to start and introspect and ask ourselves, like, how do I approach this conversation? And I know even if no one else watches this video and no one else gets anything out of it, like, I know that, like, I have been afraid to have conversations about Israel.
Exactly.
Because I don't know how to parse it in my own mind. I don't know what other people are thinking.
Exactly.
And as you said, this only gets more complicated when we talk about, like, you know, we're focused, like, not just introspecting in ourselves, but introspecting as Jewish people. There's a whole bunch of other people involved. The conflict isn't among Jews primarily. I mean, there are conflicts there, right? But the conflict is amongst peoples. And so if we don't start here, we'll never get to this generational goal of, like, eventually finding some resolution, some shared vision. So I appreciate you putting this out in public and helping people work through it.
And I'm going to presume you would feel more comfortable having conversations about, if the conversation is where do you fit on this Venn diagram, then where do you fit in this conflict conversation?
Absolutely.
And I'm going to presume you'd probably feel more comfortable having this conversation with a much wider group of people, either one-on-one or in groups, than you would the what's going on in Israel one.
Yeah.
Right? And it looks like you might even be excited about this.
I mean, the natural next step is to bring, I mean, you know, as once we introspect as individuals, once we have a conversation like this, it just makes sense to pull in somebody who isn't inside the Venn diagram at all, right? Somebody who has their own version of that, right? Like, say, a Palestinian person who has their own version of the land and the government and their theology or their personhood or their nationhood, right? And to say, here's what the Jewish part of it looks like. How does that intersect with where you're coming from? We're cousins, after all. We all come from the same place.
Isaac and Ishmael, if you take the Bible at face value.
Yeah, and even if you don't, at least we know where that fits on the Venn diagram.
Actually, that would be fascinating. I wonder if within the Palestinian and or Arab and or Muslim community, if these three...
If there's parallels.
Right, if these three might be similar, or at least close enough, or if they're widely different. Because if there's a lot of similarities, right, or if we can kind of come up with some common language, now this is a conversation I also think will be far less threatening than you're Palestinian, I'm Israeli, let's talk.
Right.
You're Muslim, I'm Jewish, let's talk. That can be intimidating. What's the Venn diagram that you see? Where do you fit yourself on yours? This is my Venn diagram. Where do I fit myself on mine? Because it doesn't presuppose that we're going to get along at all. Right? Whereas the let's talk, there's almost this desperation, this plea, like I want us to connect. Which, by the way, I don't think is necessarily bad instinct. Right. But there's almost this desperation and plea, like, I want us to connect, Versus, like, this is a way for me to be able to see a little bit more of you through your eyes because of this construct. Yeah. As opposed to tell me your story or tell me your narrative or tell me your perspective. Right.
Yeah. Something like
this could be really worth exploring.
I mean, something like this is like could be a mirror that turns into a doorway.
Yeah.
Right. I love it. I think it's, at least it's, like I said, been incredibly helpful for me.
Great.
I wouldn't even, I think moving forward, I wouldn't even really need the Venn diagram like as a focal point for the conversation. It just, like, now that I've worked through the introspection with you and will continue to do that, like, I feel like I have a place to enter into conversation.
Yes.
And that regardless of how the other person is coming at it or what they know about this, I have a foundation, like a place to start that, like, my identity is clear, my position is clear, I understand where I'm coming from. And of course we haven't even really touched on, like, where either of us stand in a lot of this. Like, some of our opinions have seeped out here, but there's a whole different video about, like, now that we know this framework, what do you believe about each of these parts? Which I think is fascinating and incredibly helpful. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. And thank you all very much for watching. I don't know if I should be saying thank you for watching this video or thank you for watching these videos. We haven't yet figured out. There's going to be one long video broken up into parts, but thank you for watching. A huge thank you again, Ben, for your inspiration, wisdom, your time, your willingness to record, your willingness to do this conversation publicly, which it's always one thing for you and me to talk, because I think we trust each other. I trust you, right? I think we trust each other. We could, I presume, talk about anything at any time. And it's another thing to have a conversation that borders on contentious and irascible and offensive in a more public forum. So thank you very much for your willingness to do that. And I say this often, comments, questions, reflections, please let me know. I will respond. I will get back to you. I cannot promise Ben necessarily will or won't, but he might from time to time. But please do let us know. And thank you all very, very much again.